"Let us prepare a thermometer," said Barbicane. We may imagine that an ordinary thermometer would afford no result under the circumstances in which this instrument was to be exposed. The mercury would have been frozen in its bulk, as below 42 Fahrenheit below zero. It is no longer liquid. But Barbicane had furnished himself with a spirit thermometer on Wafferdin's system, which gives the minimum of excessively low temperatures. Before beginning the experiment, this instrument was compared with an ordinary one, and then Barbicane prepared to use it. "How shall we set about it?" asked Nicholl. "Nothing is easier," replied Michel Ardan, who was never at a loss. "We open the scuttle rapidly, throw out the instrument, it follows the projectile with exemplary docility, and a quarter of an hour after, draw it in." "With the hand?" asked Barbicane. "With the hand," replied Michel. "Well, then, my friend, do not expose yourself," answered Barbicane, "for the hand that you draw in again will be nothing but a stump frozen and deformed by the frightful cold. Really, you will feel as if you had had a terrible burn, like that of iron at a white heat. For whether the heat leaves our bodies briskly or enters briskly, it is exactly the same thing. Besides, I am not at all certain that the objects we have thrown out are still following us." "Why not?" asked Nicholl. "Because, if we are passing through an atmosphere of the slightest density, these objects will be retarded again. The darkness prevents our seeing if they still float around us, but in order not to expose ourselves to the loss of our thermometer, we will fasten it, and we can then more easily pull it back again." Barbicane's advice was followed. Through the scuttle rapidly opened, Nicholl threw out the instrument, which was held by a short cord, so that it might be more easily drawn up. The scuttle had not been opened more than a second, but that second had sufficed to let in a most intense cold. "The devil!" exclaimed Michel Ardan. "It is cold enough to freeze a white bear." Barbicane waited until half an hour had elapsed, which was more than time enough to allow the instrument to fall to the level of the surrounding temperature. Then it was rapidly pulled in. Barbicane calculated the quantity of spirits of wine overflowed into the little vial, soldered to the lower part of the instrument, and said, 140 degrees centigrade below zero." M. Poulet was right, and Freer wrong. That was the undoubted temperature of the starry space, such as, perhaps, that of the lunar continents, when the orb of night has lost by radiation all the heat which 15 days of sun have poured into her. Chapter 15. Hyperbole A or Parabole A. We may, perhaps, be astonished to find Barbicane and his companions so little occupied with the future reserved for them in their metal prison, which was bearing them through the infinity of space. Instead of asking where they were going, they passed their time making experiments, as if they had been quietly installed in their own study. We might answer that men so strong-minded were above such anxiety they did not trouble themselves about such trifles, and that they had something else to do than to occupy their minds with the future. The truth was that they were not masters of their projectile. They could neither check its course, nor alter its direction. A sailor can change the head of his ship as he pleases. An aeronaut can give a vertical motion to his balloon. They, on the contrary, had no power over their vehicle. Every maneuver was forbidden, hence the inclination to let things alone, or as the sailors say, let her run. Where did they find themselves at this moment, at 8 o'clock in the morning of the day, called upon the earth the 6th of December? very certainly in the neighborhood of the moon, and even near enough for her to look to them like an enormous black screen upon the firmament. As to the distance which separated them, it was impossible to estimate it. The projectile, held by some unaccountable force, had been within 4 miles of grazing the satellite's north pole. But since entering the cone of shadow these last 2 hours, had the distance increased or diminished? Every point of mark was wanting by which to estimate both the direction and the speed of the projectile. Perhaps it was rapidly leaving the disk, so that it would soon quit the pure shadow. Perhaps, again, on the other hand, it might be nearing it so much that in a short time, it might strike some high point on the invisible hemisphere, which would doubtlessly have ended the journey much to the detriment of the travelers. A discussion arose on this subject, and Michel Ardan, always ready with an explanation, gave it as his opinion that the projectile, held by the lunar attraction, would end by falling on the surface of the terrestrial globe, like an aerolite. First of all, my friend, answered Barbicane, every aerolite does not fall to the earth. It is only a small proportion which do so. And if we had passed into an aerolite, it does not necessarily follow that we should ever reach the surface of the moon. But how if we get near enough? Replied Michel. Pure mistake, replied Barbicane. Have you not seen shooting stars rush through the sky by thousands at certain seasons? Yes. Well, these stars, or rather corpuscles, only shine when they are heated by gliding over the atmospheric layers. Now, if they enter the atmosphere, they pass at least within 40 miles of the earth, but they seldom fall upon it. The same with our projectile. It may approach very near to the moon, and not yet fall upon it. But then, asked Michel, I shall be curious to know how our erring vehicle will act in space. I see but 2 hypotheses, replied Barbicane, after some moments' reflection. What are they? The projectile has the choice between 2 mathematical curves, and it will follow one or the other according to the speed with which it is animated, and which at this moment I cannot estimate. Yes, said Nicole, it will follow either a parabola or a hyperbola. Just so, replied Barbicane, with a certain speed, it will assume the parabola, and with a greater the hyperbola. I like those grand words, exclaimed Michel Ardan. One knows directly what they mean, and pray what is your parabola, if you please? My friend, answered the captain, the parabola is a curve of the 2nd order, the result of the section of a cone intersected by a plane parallel to one of the sides. Said Michel in a satisfied tone. It is very nearly, continued Nicole, the course described by a bomb launched from a mortar. Perfect. And the hyperbola? The hyperbola, Michel, is a curve of the 2nd order, produced by the intersection of a conic surface and a plane parallel to its axis, and constitutes 2 branches separated one from the other, both tending indefinitely in the 2 directions. Is it possible? Exclaimed Michel Ardan in a serious tone, as if they had told him of some serious event. What I particularly like in your definition of the hyperbola, I was going to say hyperbola, is that it is still more obscure than the word you pretend to define. Nicole and Barbicane cared little for Michel Ardan's fun. They were deep in a scientific discussion. What curve would the projectile follow? Was their hobby? One maintained the hyperbola, the other the parabola. They gave each other reasons, bristling with X. Their arguments were couched in language which made Michel jump. The discussion was hot, and neither would give up his chosen curve to his adversary. This scientific dispute lasted so long that it made Michel very impatient. Now, gentlemen cosines, will you cease to throw parabolas and hyperbolas at each other's heads? I want to understand the only interesting question in the whole affair. We shall follow one or the other of these curves. Good, but where will they lead us to? Nowhere, replied Nickel. How, nowhere? Evidently, said Barbicane, they are open curves, which may be prolonged indefinitely. En savants, cried Michel, and what are either the one or the other to us from the moment? We know that they equally led us into infinite space. Barbicane and Nickel could not forbear smiling. They had just been creating art for art's sake. Never had so idle a question been raised at such an inopportune moment. The sinister truth remained that, whether hyperbolically or parabolically borne away, the projectile would never again meet either the earth or the moon. What would become of these bold travelers in the immediate future? If they did not die of hunger, if they did not die of thirst in some days, when the gas failed, they would die from want of air, unless the cold had killed them first. Still important as it was to economize the gas, the excessive lowness of the surrounding temperature obliged them to consume a certain quantity. Strictly speaking, they could do without its light, but not without its heat. Fortunately, the caloric generated by Riset's and Regnot's apparatus raised the temperature of the interior of the projectile a little, and without much expenditure, they were able to keep it bearable. But observations had now become very difficult. The dampness of the projectile was condensed on the windows, and congealed immediately. This cloudiness had to be dispersed continually. In any case, they might hope to be able to discover some phenomena of the highest interest. But up to this time, the disk remained dumb and dark. It did not answer the multiplicity of questions put by these ardent minds. A matter which drew this reflection from Michel, apparently a just one. If ever we begin this journey over again, we shall do well to choose the time when the moon is at the full. Certainly, said Nicole, that circumstance will be more favorable. I allow that the moon, immersed in the sun's rays, will not be visible during the transit, but instead we should see the earth, which would be full, and what is more, if we were drawn round the moon, as at this moment, we should at least have the advantage of seeing the invisible part of her disk magnificently lit. Well said, Nicole, replied Michel Ardan. What do you think, Barbicane? I think this, answered the grave president, if ever we begin this journey again, we shall start at the same time, and under the same conditions. Suppose we had attained our end, would it not have been better to have found continents in broad daylight than a country plunged in utter darkness? Would not our first installation have been made under better circumstances? Yes, evidently, as to the invisible side, we could have visited it in our exploring expeditions on the lunar globe, so that the time of the full moon was well chosen, but we ought to have arrived at the end. And in order to have so arrived, we ought to have suffered no deviation on the road. I have nothing to say to that, answered Michel Ardan. Here is, however, a good opportunity lost of observing the other side of the moon. But the projectile was now describing in the shadow that incalculable course, which no sight mark would allow them to ascertain, had its direction been altered either by the influence of the lunar attraction or by the action of some unknown star. Barbicane could not say, but a change had taken place in the relative position of the vehicle, and Barbicane verified it about 4 in the morning. The change consisted in this, that the base of the projectile had turned toward the moon's surface, and was so held by a perpendicular, passing through its axis, the attraction, that is to say the weight, had brought about this alteration. The heaviest part of the projectile inclined toward the invisible disk as if it would fall upon it. Was it falling? Were the travelers attaining that much desired end? No, and the observation of a sign point, quite inexplicable in itself, showed Barbicane that his projectile was not nearing the moon, and that it had shifted by following an almost concentric curve. This point of mark was a luminous brightness, which Nicholl sighted suddenly on the limit of the horizon formed by the black disk. This point could not be confounded with a star. It was a reddish incandescence, which increased by degrees, a decided proof that the projectile was shifting toward it, and not falling normally on the surface of the moon. A volcano, it is a volcano in action, cried Nicholl, a dissembling of the interior fires of the moon. That world is not quite extinguished. Yes, an eruption, replied Barbicane, who was carefully studying the phenomenon through his night glass. What should it be, if not a volcano? But, then, said Michel Ardan, in order to maintain that combustion, there must be air, so the atmosphere does surround that part of the moon. Perhaps so, replied Barbicane, but not necessarily. The volcano, by the decomposition of certain substances, can provide its own oxygen, and thus throw flames into space. It seems to me that the deflagration, by the intense brilliancy of the substances in combustion, is produced in pure oxygen. We must not be in a hurry to proclaim the existence of a lunar atmosphere. The fiery mountain must have been situated about the 45 south latitude, on the invisible part of the disk. But, to Barbicane's great displeasure, the curve which the projectile was describing was taking it far from the point indicated by the eruption. Thus he could not determine its nature exactly. Half an hour after being sighted, this luminous point had disappeared behind the dark horizon. But the verification of this phenomenon was of considerable consequence. In their selenographic studies, it proved that all heat had not yet disappeared from the bowels of this globe. And where heat exists, who can affirm that the vegetable kingdom, nay, even the animal kingdom itself, has not up to this time resisted all destructive influences? The existence of this volcano in eruption, unmistakably seen by these earthly savants, would doubtless give rise to many theories favorable to the grave question of the habitability of the moon. Barbicane allowed himself to be carried away by these reflections. He forgot himself in a deep reverie, in which the mysterious destiny of the lunar world was uppermost. He was seeking to combine together the facts observed up to that time, when a new incident recalled him briskly to reality. This incident was more than a cosmical phenomenon. It was a threatened danger, the consequence of which might be disastrous in the extreme. Suddenly, in the midst of the ether, in the profound darkness, an enormous mass appeared. It was like a moon, but an incandescent moon, whose brilliancy was all the more intolerable as it cut sharply on the frightful darkness of space. This mass, of a circular form, threw a light which filled the projectile. The forms of Barbicane, Nicholl, and Michel Ardan, bathed in its white sheets, assumed that livid spectral appearance which physicians produce with the fictitious light of alcohol impregnated with salt. By Jove, cried Michel Ardan, we are hideous. What is that ill-conditioned moon? A meteor, replied Barbicane. A meteor burning in space? Yes. This shooting globe suddenly appearing in shadow at a distance of at most 200 miles ought, according to Barbicane, to have a diameter of 2,000 yards. It advanced at a speed of about 1 mile and a half per second. It cut the projectile's path and must reach it in some minutes. As it approached, it grew to enormous proportions. Imagine, if possible, the situation of the travelers. It is impossible to describe it. In spite of their courage, their sang-froid, their carelessness of danger, they were mute, motionless with stiffened limbs, a prey to frightful terror. Their projectile, the course of which they could not alter, was rushing straight on this ignited mass. More intense than the open mouth of an oven, it seemed as though they were being precipitated toward an abyss of fire. Barbicane had seized the hands of his two companions, and all three looked through their half-open eyelids upon that asteroid heated to a white heat. If thought was not destroyed within them, if their brains still worked amid all this awe, they must have given themselves up for lost. 2 minutes after the sudden appearance of the meteor, to them 2 centuries of anguish, the projectile seemed almost about to strike it, when the globe of fire burst like a bomb, but without making any noise in that void where sound, which is but the agitation of the layers of air, could not be generated. Nicholl uttered a cry, and he and his companions rushed to the scuttle. What a sight! What pen can describe it? What palette is rich enough in colors to reproduce so magnificent a spectacle? It was like the opening of a crater, like the scattering of an immense conflagration. Thousands of luminous fragments lit up and irradiated space with their fires. Every size, every color was there intermingled. There were rays of yellow and pale yellow, red, green, a crown of fireworks of all colors of the enormous and much dreaded globe. There remained nothing but these fragments carried in all directions, now become asteroids in their turn, some flaming like a sword, some surrounded by a whitish cloud, and others leaving behind them trains of brilliant cosmical dust. These incandescent blocks crossed and struck each other, scattering still smaller fragments, some of which struck the projectile. Its left scuttle was even cracked by a violent shock. It seemed to be floating amid a hail of howitzer shells, the smallest of which might destroy it instantly. The light which saturated the ether was so wonderfully intense that Michel, drawing Barbicane and Nicholl to his window, exclaimed, "The invisible moon, visible at last!" And through a luminous emanation, which lasted some seconds, the whole three caught a glimpse of that mysterious disk, which the eye of man now saw for the first time. What could they distinguish at a distance, which they could not estimate? Some lengthened bands along the disk, real clouds formed in the midst of a very confined atmosphere, from which emerged not only all the mountains, but also projections of less importance. Its circles, its yawning craters, as capriciously placed as on the visible surface. Then immense spaces, no longer arid plains, but real seas, oceans, widely distributed, reflecting on their liquid surface all the dazzling magic of the fires of space. And, lastly, on the surface of the continents, large dark masses, looking like immense forests, under the rapid illumination of a brilliance. Was it an illusion, a mistake, an optical illusion? Could they give a scientific assent to an observation so superficially obtained? Dared they pronounce upon the question of its habitability, after so slight a glimpse of the invisible disk? But the lightnings in space subsided by degrees. Its accidental brilliancy died away. The asteroids dispersed in different directions and were extinguished in the distance. The ether returned to its accustomed darkness. The stars, eclipsed for a moment, again twinkled in the firmament, and the disk, so hastily descended, was again buried in impenetrable night. CHAPTER 16 THE Southern Hemisphere. The projectile had just escaped a terrible danger, and a very unforeseen one. Who would have thought of such an encounter with meteors? These erring bodies might create serious perils for the travelers. They were to them so many sandbanks upon that sea of ether which, less fortunate than sailors, they could not escape. But did these adventurers complain of space? No, not since nature had given them the splendid sight of a cosmical meteor bursting from expansion, since this inimitable firework, which no Ruggieri could imitate, had lit up for some seconds the invisible glory of the moon. In that flash, continents, seas, and forests had become visible to them. Did an atmosphere, then, bring to this unknown face its life-giving atoms? Questions still insoluble, and forever closed against human curiosity. It was then 3:30 in the afternoon. The projectile was following its curvilinear direction round the moon. Had its course again been altered by the meteor? It was to be feared so, but the projectile must describe a curve unalterably determined by the laws of mechanical reasoning. Barbicane was inclined to believe that this curve would be rather a parabola than a hyperbola, but admitting the parabola, the projectile must quickly have passed through the cone of shadow projected into space opposite the sun. This cone, indeed, is very narrow, the angular diameter of the moon being so little, when compared with the diameter of the orb of day. And up to this time, the projectile had been floating in this deep shadow, whatever had been its speed, and it could not have been insignificant. Its period of occultation continued, that was evident, but perhaps that would not have been the case in a supposedly rigidly parabolical trajectory. A new problem, which tormented Barbicane's brain. Imprisoned as he was in a circle of unknowns, which he could not unravel. Neither of the travelers thought of taking an instant's repose. Each one watched for an unexpected fact, which might throw some new light on their onographic studies. About 5 o'clock, Michel Ardan distributed, under the name of dinner, some pieces of bread and cold meat, which were quickly swallowed, without either of them abandoning their scuttle, the glass of which was incessantly encrusted by the condensation of vapor. About 45 minutes past 5 in the evening, Nicholl, armed with his glass, sighted toward the southern border of the moon, and in the direction followed by the projectile. Some bright points cut upon the dark shield of the sky. They looked like a succession of sharp points lengthened into a tremulous line. They were very bright. Such appeared the terminal line of the moon, when in one of her octants. They could not be mistaken. It was no longer a simple meteor. This luminous ridge had neither color nor motion, nor was it a volcano in eruption, and Barbicane did not hesitate to pronounce upon it. "The sun!" he exclaimed. "What, the sun?" answered Nicholl and Michel Ardan. "Yes, my friends, it is the radiant orb itself lighting up the summit of the mountains, situated on the southern borders of the moon. We are evidently nearing the South Pole." "After having passed the North Pole," replied Michel, "we have made the circuit of our satellite, then." "Yes, my good Michel. Then, no more hyperbolas, no more parabolas, no more open curves to fear. No, but a closed curve, which is called an ellipse. Instead of losing itself in interplanetary space, it is probable that the projectile will describe an elliptical orbit around the moon. Indeed, and that it will become her satellite." "Moon of the moon," cried Michel Ardan. "Only, I would have you observe, my worthy friend," replied Barbicane, "that we are none the less lost for that. "Yes, in another manner, and much more pleasantly," answered the careless Frenchman with his most amiable smile. Chapter 17. Tycho. At 6 in the evening, the projectile passed the South Pole, at less than 40 miles off, a distance equal to that already reached at the North Pole. The elliptical curve was being rigidly carried out. At this moment the travelers once more entered the blessed rays of the sun. They saw once more those stars, which moved slowly from east to west. The radiant orb was saluted by a triple hurrah. With its light it also sent heat, which soon pierced the metal walls. The glass resumed its accustomed appearance. The layers of ice melted as if by enchantment. And immediately, for economy's sake, the gas was put out, the air apparatus alone consuming its usual quantity. "Ah," said Nicole, "these rays of heat are good. With what impatience must the Selenites wait the reappearance of the orb of day." "Yes," replied Michel Ardan, imbibing as it were the brilliant ether. "Light and heat, all life is contained in them." At this moment the bottom of the projectile deviated somewhat from the lunar surface, in order to follow the slightly lengthened elliptical orbit. From this point, had the Earth been at the full, Barbicane and his companions could have seen it, but immersed in the sun's irradiation, she was quite invisible. Another spectacle attracted their attention, that of the southern part of the moon. Brought by the glasses to within 450 yards, they did not again leave the scuttles, and noted every detail of this fantastical continent. Mounts Dorfel and Leibniz formed two separate groups, very near the South Pole. The first group extended from the pole to the 84th parallel on the eastern part of the orb. The second occupied the eastern border, extending from the 65 of latitude to the pole. On their capriciously formed ridge appeared dazzling sheets, as mentioned by Persecchi, with more certainty than the illustrious Roman astronomer. Barbicane was enabled to recognize their nature. "They are snow," he exclaimed. "Snow," repeated Nicole. "Yes, Nicole, snow, the surface of which is deeply frozen. See how they reflect the luminous rays. Cooled lava would never give out such intense reflection. There must then be water, there must be air on the moon, as little as you please, but the fact can no longer be contested. No, it could not be, and if ever Barbicane should see the Earth again, his notes will bear witness to this great fact in his selenographic observations. These mountains of Dorfel and Leibniz rose in the midst of plains of a medium extent, which were bounded by an indefinite succession of circles and annular ramparts. These two chains are the only ones met within this region of circles. Comparatively but slightly marked, they throw up here and there some sharp points, the highest summit of which attains an altitude of 24,600 feet. But the projectile was high above all this landscape, and the projections disappeared in the intense brilliancy of the disk, and to the eyes of the travelers, there reappeared that original aspect of the lunar landscapes, raw in tone, without gradation of colors, and without degrees of shadow, roughly black and white from the want of diffusion of light. But the sight of this desolate world did not fail to captivate them by its very strangeness. They were moving over this region, as if they had been borne on the breath of some storm, watching heights defile under their feet, piercing the cavities with their eyes, going down into the rifts, climbing the ramparts, sounding these mysterious holes, and leveling all cracks, but no trace of vegetation, no appearance of cities. Nothing but stratification, beds of lava, overflowings polished like immense mirrors, reflecting the sun's rays with overpowering brilliancy, Nothing belonging to a living world ever think to a dead world, where avalanches, rolling from the summits of the mountains, would disperse noiselessly at the bottom of the abyss, retaining the motion, but wanting the sound. In any case, it was the image of death, without its being possible even to say that life had ever existed there. Michel Ardan, however, thought he recognized a heap of ruins, to which he drew Barbicane's attention. It was about the 80th parallel, in 30 longitude. This heap of stones, rather regularly placed, represented a vast fortress overlooking a long rift, which in former days had served as a bed to the rivers of prehistorical times. Not far from that, rose to a height of 17,400 feet, the Anila mountain of short, equal to the Asiatic Caucasus. Michel Ardan, with his accustomed ardor, maintained the evidences of his fortress. Beneath it he discerned the dismantled ramparts of a town. Here the still intact arch of a portico, there 2 or 3 columns lying under their base. Farther on, a succession of arches, which must have supported the conduit of an aqueduct. In another part the sunken pillars of a gigantic bridge, run into the thickest parts of the rift. He distinguished all this, but with so much imagination in his glance, and through glasses so fantastical, that we must mistrust his observation. But who could affirm, who would dare to say, that the amiable fellow did not really see that which his two companions would not see? Moments were too precious to be sacrificed in idle discussion. The Selenite city, whether imaginary or not, had already disappeared afar off. The distance of the projectile from the lunar disk was on the increase, and the details of the soil were being lost in a confused jumble. The reliefs, the circles, the craters, and the plains alone remained, and still showed their boundary lines distinctly. At this moment, to the left lay extended one of the finest circles of lunar orography, one of the curiosities of this continent. It was Newton, which Barbicane recognized without trouble by referring to the Mappa Selenographica. Newton is situated in exactly 77 south latitude and 16 east longitude. It forms an annular crater, the ramparts of which, rising to a height of 21,300 feet, seemed to be impassable. Barbicane made his companions observe that the height of this mountain above the surrounding plain was far from equaling the depth of its crater. This enormous hole was beyond all measurement, and formed a gloomy abyss, the bottom of which the sun's rays could never reach. There, according to Humboldt, reigns utter darkness, which the light of the sun and the earth cannot break. Mythologists could well have made it the mouth of hell. Newton, said Barbicane, is the most perfect type of these annular mountains, of which the earth possesses no sample. They prove that the moon's formation, by means of cooling, is due to violent causes. For while, under the pressure of internal fires, the reliefs rise to considerable height, the depths withdraw far below the lunar level. I do not dispute the fact, replied Michel Ardan. Some minutes after passing Newton, the projectile directly overlooked the Anila mountains of Morit. It skirted at some distance the summits of Blancanus, and at about 7:30 in the evening, reached the circle of Clavius. This circle, one of the most remarkable of the disk, is situated in 58 south latitude and 15 east longitude. Its height is estimated at 22,950 feet. The travelers, at a distance of 24 miles, reduced to 4 by their glasses, could admire this vast crater in its entirety. Terrestrial volcanoes, said Barbicane, are but molehills compared with those of the moon. Measuring the old craters formed by the first eruptions of Vesuvius and Etna, we find them little more than 3 miles in breadth. In France, the circle of Cantal measures 6 miles across. At Ceylon, the circle of the island is 40 miles, which is considered the largest on the globe. What are these diameters against that of Clavius, which we overlook at this moment? What is its breadth? Asked Nickel. It is 150 miles, replied Barbicane. This circle is certainly the most important on the moon, but many others measure 150, 100, or 75 miles. Well, my friends, exclaimed Michel, can you picture to yourselves what this now peaceful orb of night must have been when its craters, filled with thunderings, vomited at the same time smoke and tongues of flame? What a wonderful spectacle then, and now what decay? This moon is nothing more than a thin carcase of fireworks, whose squabs, rockets, serpents, and suns, after a superb brilliancy, have left but sadly broken cases. Who can say the cause, the reason, the motive force of these cataclysms? Barbicane was not listening to Michel Ardan. He was contemplating these ramparts of Clavius, formed by large mountains spread over several miles. At the bottom of the immense cavity burrowed hundreds of small extinguished craters, riddling the soil like a colander, and overlooked by a peak 15,000 feet high. Around the plain appeared desolate, nothing so arid as these reliefs, nothing so sad as these ruins of mountains, and if we may so express ourselves, these fragments of peaks and mountains, which strewed the soil. The satellite seemed to have burst at this spot. The projectile was still advancing, and this movement did not subside. Circles, craters, and uprooted mountains succeeded each other incessantly. No more plains, no more seas, never-ending Switzerland and Norway, and lastly, in the canter of this region of crevices, the most splendid mountain on the lunar disk, the dazzling Tycho, in which posterity will ever preserve the name of the illustrious Danish astronomer. In observing the full moon in a cloudless sky, no one has failed to remark this brilliant point of the southern hemisphere. Michel Ardan used every metaphor that his imagination could supply to designate it by. To him this Tycho was a focus of light, a center of irradiation, a crater vomiting rays. It was the tire of a brilliant wheel, an asteria enclosing the disk with its silver tentacles, an enormous eye filled with flames, a glory carved for Pluto's head, a star launched by the Creator's hand, and crushed against the face of the moon. Tycho forms such a concentration of light that the inhabitants of the earth can see it without glasses, though at a distance of 240,000 miles. Imagine, then, its intensity to the eye of observers placed at a distance of only 50 miles. Seen through this pure ether, its brilliancy was so intolerable that Barbicane and his friends were obliged to blacken their glasses with the gas smoke before they could bear the splendor. Then silent, scarcely uttering an interjection of admiration, they gazed, they contemplated. All their feelings, all their impressions, were concentrated in that look, as under any violent emotion, all life is concentrated at the heart. Tycho belongs to the system of radiating mountains, like Aristarchus and Copernicus, but it is of all the most complete and decided, showing unquestionably the frightful volcanic action to which the formation of the moon is due. Tycho is situated in 43 south latitude and 12 east longitude. Its center is occupied by a crater 50 miles broad. It assumes a slightly elliptical form and is surrounded by an enclosure of annular ramparts, which on the east and west overlook the outer plain. From a height of 15,000 feet, it is a group of Mont Blancs placed round one common center and crowned by radiating beams. What this incomparable mountain really is, with all the projections converging toward it, and the interior excrescences of its crater, photography itself could never represent. Indeed, it is during the full moon that Tycho is seen in all its splendor. Then all shadows disappear, the foreshortening of perspective disappears, and all proofs become whitey, a disagreeable fact, for this strange region would have been marvelous if reproduced with photographic exactness. It is but a group of hollows, craters, circles, a network of crests. Then, as far as the eye could see, a whole volcanic network cast upon this encrusted soil. One can then understand that the bubbles of this central eruption have kept their first form. Crystallized by cooling, they have stereotyped that aspect which the moon formerly presented when under the Plutonian forces. The distance which separated the travelers from the annular summits of Tycho was not so great, but that they could catch the principal details, even on the causeway, forming the fortifications of Tycho. The mountains hanging on to the interior and exterior sloping flanks rose in stories like gigantic terraces. They appeared to be higher by 300 or 400 feet to the west than to the east. No system of terrestrial encampment could equal these natural fortifications. A town built at the bottom of this circular cavity would have been utterly inaccessible and wonderfully extended over this soil, covered with picturesque projections. Indeed, nature had not left the bottom of this crater flat and empty. It possessed its own peculiar orography, a mountainous system, making it a world in itself. The travelers could distinguish clearly cones, central hills, remarkable positions of the soil, naturally placed to receive the chef's d'oeuvre of Selenite architecture. There was marked out the place for a temple, here the ground of a forum, on this spot the plan of a palace, in another the plateau for a citadel, the whole overlooked by a central mountain of 1,500 feet, a vast circle, in which ancient Rome could have been held in its entirety 10 times over. "Ah!" exclaimed Michel Ardan, enthusiastic at the sight. "What a grand town might be constructed within that ring of mountains! A quiet city, a peaceful refuge, beyond all human misery. How calm and isolated those misanthropes, those haters of humanity might live there, and all who have a distaste for social life." "Oh, it would be too small for them," replied Barbicane simply.